So I'm back with more horror and thriller reviews today. Once again, there is construction outside, so apologies for the noise, but I have a bunch of new releases that I can't wait to share with you. Hopefully these are books that have been on your radar, and I'll let you know what I thought of them all. As well, at the end of this video, I'm going to be talking about a brand new obsession that I have, and surprisingly enough, it's actually not books, but it's book related. It's because of a book, so I think it fits into this video. Let's get started. Let's start with Boys of the Valley by Fracassi. This is a book that I received for review from the publisher, and this follows a group of boys in a Catholic orphanage. This book is set, I believe, in the beginning of the 20th century, and they are going about their daily life under the watch of these priests. And then one night, this group of men show up. They are injured, and particularly one man has these occult symbols on his body, and of course the story spirals from there. This is one that I wanted to pick up because I've read this author before. I've actually read 2 of their other novels this year. A Child Alone with Strangers. I butchered that title so many times. I know you've all mentioned in the comments. And then I also read Gothic. And reading this one, once again, I'm surprised to say that this author has incredible range. If you like Gothic, or if you like his other book, A Child Alone with Strangers, I don't know if you'll necessarily like this one or not. Not that this one is bad, just that this one is once again very different in terms of the story, the plot, the writing, the characters. There isn't a lot that I see in terms of resemblance between the novels, and so you kind of just have to try each one for yourself depending on your taste in books. Of his 3, in a lot of ways, this one fits most into my wheelhouse because it's a story involving potentially some Catholic angle to it. Has an angle of possession, which I personally really love in my horror stories. And I just have an affection for stories that involve orphan children. This is a topic that I read a lot of when I was a kid. I always read things like the Boxcar Children, all of that. And so the idea of having a group of boys who do not have parents, something about that setup just really worked for me. And I like the beginning, again, the orphanage setting. It's very slow paced. It's a lot of setup, which may not work for everyone, but I really like that. Once the story got going, it was violent, it was action packed, it was an engaging read. For whatever reason, I didn't entirely love it to the point of giving it 4 stars. It was more of a 3.5. And I think for me, it wasn't that anything was bad in terms of the author's choices of what they did. It's more I was disappointed in what they didn't do. Basically, with a novel like this that has a Catholic boarding school orphanage setup, I would expect to see more of a cutting social commentary on these religious aspects. And while the priests in the story are not great, really that is more just the background in which the story takes place. And I do think it's a missed opportunity. I really want the author to go there, and rather than just going into the supernatural, I would rather them have focused more on the darkness of humanity. And I expected them to go there, so when they didn't, I was a little bit disappointed, but I don't know if that's a fair criticism, because it's really my place to criticize an author for not writing the kind of story that I wanted this to be. Overall though, it was still a very engaging story. Lots of warnings for, again, violence involving young characters. Is that something triggering for you? Be warned. But it was an engaging story with some of my favorite tropes, so it was overall a pretty good experience. Next, let's talk about Frankie Graves by Roubique. This is part 1 of a new, what I believe will be a duology. This is a slasher horror story that is set in the 1950s. We follow a group of young teenagers. We follow particularly Frankie, who is this outsider. He's a little bit different, and well, wouldn't you know, possibly a slasher story ensues. Now, you probably recognize this book, not necessarily this exact book, but the cover art probably looks familiar because I've gushed about this author's work before on my channel. Particularly Kill River was the first that I read there, and so I was very excited to get the opportunity to read the author's newest 2023 release. It's been a few years since they've completed a book and published, so I was very excited to get back into these stories. This one is really fun because, first of all, I love the setting. I love the 1950s. I'm obsessed with the musical Grease, and everything Greasers is just my thing. And so the setting was perfect. It's fun, it's humorous, it's very nostalgic. There's lots of references to the time and place and music and all of that. And I really like it because of the fact that it takes a 1950s setting and then puts it inside the framework of what would normally be a 1980s slasher movie. And so it's fun. If I had a criticism, it's just that the the story in itself is predictable. You kind of know what's going to happen, but I think you can argue that if you went to go watch an iconic 1980s movie in the time period, those slashers were pretty predictable in themselves. And that's kind of the point of this, because a book like this is really meant to give you nostalgia for both the time period where it's set and also, again, the slashers of a lot of people's childhood and youth. So I thought that this book was really fun. I think it's on par with his other work. If anything, as a writer, he's grown over the years. I will be honest that it does feel strange to review this book because my tastes have shifted so much, and I will be totally frank that I'm someone who now reads a lot of literary horror, and so I actually review and read very little indie horror anymore. I pretty much always say no to those review requests or just don't answer them because I know I'm not necessarily going to like them as much as I used to, and that is a tiny bit here that I remember loving these fun slasher stories a tiny bit more than I do today. Not that I didn't enjoy this, but simply it's hard to compare to something like Victor LaValle or some of my all-time favorite literary authors that do really in-depth character studies and deep themes of social commentary, things like that. This book is not trying to do that, and I don't think that's a problem. I think this book is fantastic of doing what it's going to do, but it wasn't a 5-star read for me only simply because I don't think a book in this style is capable of getting that in the way that I rate my books. But did I have a great time reading it? Was it so nostalgic to go back to this author's work and these narratives? Absolutely. If you're a fan of their work, if you enjoyed the other ones and are looking for more, this is 100% worth your time to pick up. I do recommend it. Next, let's talk about Dead of Winter by Darcy Coates. And this is more of a thriller story, even though this author is typically known for writing horror. We follow a tour group who seek shelter in this cabin in the Rocky Mountains because there is a snowstorm coming in. They think that they're all safe. However, their tour guide disappears overnight. And when they find them in the morning, they have been murdered in a really horrific way. And so I like the setup for this because it's one of my favorite tropes when it comes to mysteries and thrillers, where it is a closed room setup. So you know that there's only a limited number of characters involved, and we as a reader have to puzzle out who is involved. I will say that I'm a huge fan, as you probably already know, of winter horror and thrillers. It's a time period of the year or an atmosphere that I really like. I think it works really well when it comes to chilling reads, pun not really intended, but kind of. And this is one that was good. It hit the tropes. It was classic. But as I said before with Darcy Coates, I find her writing to be fine, but she kind of plays it safe and never does anything out of the box, never something I find to be unexpected. And instead, simply she writes a really fine story. And don't get me wrong, this book may very likely show up on my recommendations of winter thrillers and horrors next year. But in terms of a mind-bending, life-changing book, it definitely wasn't this. It was fine, but honestly a little bit forgettable. If you're looking for something like this next winter, it might be one to pick up. And my last thought is more about the publishing standpoint, but I do wonder why this book is being released in July when, for at least a North American audience, I think it would do a lot better if it was published closer to the winter months. But if you're looking for something to pick up that's cold and chilling while you're sweltering in the heat, maybe this is one you want to try. Next, let's talk about The Girls of Summer by Katie Bishop. This is another book I received for review from the publisher, and this is a story that follows a woman over 2 time periods. So we have the current day where she is going to holiday in Greece with her husband, and then we also have flashbacks to when she was a young woman and she went to Greece before and had this kind of torrid love affair supposedly with this man. Now coming back as an adult, it is reframing what she believed to be this wonderful romance, and it no longer is the romance that she thought it was, and instead is realizing what this man actually did to her. So this is a book I was very interested in because I knew it was going to be very topical, leaning into a lot of the Me Too conversations. And it's one of those books that is marketed as a thriller probably to get more eyes on it. But if I'm honest, I feel like it reads a lot more like contemporary fiction, and I knew it was going to be like that going into it, so it's not necessarily a criticism, just keep that in mind. There really isn't necessarily plot twists because the synopsis kind of tells you where the story is going to go, and instead you're just watching it unfold and getting to find out the details of that. And so I had no problem that it wasn't necessarily a thriller. My criticism of this book is just the fact that it wasn't very punchy. I really wanted an ending or a build-up to lead to something really powerful. I think the topic, the theme that this book is attempting to tackle is incredibly important, and it's so easy to put out a story like this, but it's so hard to do that in a way that's going to actually leave an impact to make people think and discuss and open up conversations between friends that are reading this. And this one just, again, felt a little bit safe, a little bit too easy, and I wish the author had really gone there and made this a memorable story, because I remember kind of finishing it and getting kind of the later reveals and being kind of underwhelmed, which is a really disappointing thing to say in a story that was otherwise pretty interesting. I liked the flashbacks, I liked the build-up, I liked her tense relationship with her husband, but as it all came together, it was a little bit less than I expected. And I also want to talk about The Shadow Girls by Alice Blanchard. This is another book I received for review from the publisher. This is a story that follows a female detective, and right at the beginning of the story, someone is dead and someone is in the hospital. This is the most vague synopsis I will ever give you for a mystery thriller, and that is because this is book 4 in the series. And I did the thing where I requested the book because it sounded interesting, not realizing it was book 4. But because it's a mystery novel, I wasn't actually worried, because I've read several series before where they're technically companion series where they simply follow the same detective, and at most I've ever had some relationship drama spoiled for me. But in terms of the stories, they're always completely separate. However, the starting events on this one must be the ending events of book 3, because I don't even want to say who's murdered and who is in the hospital, because I feel like it'll completely spoil the books up to this point. This is a series that definitely reminded me a bit of the Kate Burkholder series by Linda Castillo, one of my favorites, because it has, once again, a strong female detective, and it's a story that has a little bit of romance, a good mystery at the center of it, and kind of a good blend between mystery and a little bit of thrilling moments where there's a little bit more action on the page. So I like this one. I just wish I'd read the beginning first. So if you are interested in the series, I would look up this author and start with book 1, but I will keep you posted if I get back to the beginning, because again, it's lots of potential. I just wish I didn't jump into the middle, which is my fault. Now, switching over to true crime, I also read a book called I Know Who You Are, and this is a story of a woman who was a patent lawyer and retired, and then in her retirement days, she started to work for this volunteer organization where she helped to build generational trees to help connect individuals with their birth family. So this is someone who perhaps is adopted and is now trying to figure out who they're related to if their adoption was closed. And so what they do is they upload the person's DNA to a website, and then they go and try to find near relatives using that information. And this woman was contacted by those that were involved in the investigation of the Golden State Killer, the story or serial killer that was well known through the story now of I'll Be Gone in the Dark. You're probably familiar with it there. And so this book particularly tells the story of the genealogist who did the work to track down who this person was and help to bring the Golden State Killer to justice in his older age. And so this is a story that I found absolutely fascinating. It is a first-person memoir true crime book. I'll admit that this book started out a little bit slow for me just because it kind of starts talking about this woman's life and her background, but once it got into the part actually dealing with the Golden State Killer, I was completely hooked. This is a story that has always haunted me, a true crime case that really captured my attention and really pulled me into the genre. And I found the actual descriptions or details of how this was done so fascinating, because I just thought you stick the DNA into these sites and then it tells you exactly who this person must be related to, and I thought it was very straightforward because, again, all the books that have been published so far had to summarize it into a really nice, tight package. But once she actually went through the full detail of how this worked out, it's a lot more complicated, and I love those complications. So you have to connect the details and connect the dots, and basically you build up the person's tree and then you build it down again, and you have to figure out who they're related to based off that match. And then you get complications because perhaps someone is adopted and they didn't know that. Perhaps someone was married to their spouse, but maybe someone had an affair, and so the DNA doesn't really match the family tree. Or maybe the family, in some cases, not in this case, but in others, are polygamous, and then it gets a whole lot harder to match everyone together. And I found those details absolutely fascinating. Basically, as I read this book, I was gushing about it online to anyone who would listen, and to my husband, who probably didn't care, but I was so fascinated by it. And I was telling my husband that after this, I want to figure out how to do this myself. I would love to do it. I don't know if this is going to happen in the short term, but I'm really interested in the technology around it. I think I would really like it. Apparently the work is super time consuming, super detailed, and super particular, and it just sounds the exact kind of thing that I would love. I kind of have a nerdy personality, if you can't tell. So this book has gotten me completely obsessed in doing this. I don't know if this is going to happen. I'll keep you posted if anyone is actually interested. But as a story, I found it to be very interesting and really brought to light some of the, of course, challenges surrounding this new technology and how there's now going to be more legal ramifications and the questioning of like how far is police allowed to go to use this technology and so forth, and how much privacy do we have with our DNA. I loved all the conversations, thought it was super interesting, and I'm obsessed and I need to talk about it online, which is why I'm doing a booktube video on it. And then to keep fueling that true crime obsession, I also read We Keep the Dead Close by Becky Cooper. This is a story that follows a student in Harvard who is obsessed with a case that happened years ago. There was a woman who died on campus in her room, and the murder was not solved. It is still a cold case at the time that she is writing her story, and she is trying to go about throughout the university to track down who possibly did it, to try to learn more. This is a story that is very much based around gossip and rumors, so she speaks to the individual students who were involved, she speaks to the profs, she speaks to the students that are there today about what is being told. So in terms of a story, this is one that, again, is more about gossip than fact for a lot of it. And so keep that in mind. I can see this book not being for everyone, but I am someone who's just fascinated by true crime. I've always had this strange idea that maybe one day a particular case will fall in my lap, something that is local to me, that will become my version of what Michelle McNamara did with the Golden State Killer. And so I definitely relate to this young woman's obsession with this case, even if she didn't necessarily have the investigative tools to do anything in terms of dragging up new evidence. Without saying too much, I'll let you know that this book does have some sort of conclusion, but that conclusion kind of leaves more questions open and leaves things hanging, so it's kind of unsatisfying in of itself. And this book is a little bit too long when it comes to the details. Some parts I just didn't care about as much as the author did, but overall it was interesting. And I could recognize her obsession, I could relate to it, and it kind of makes me want to also solve a crime on top of my genealogy obsession. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know, is there a book that has ever started an obsession for you? Not necessarily an obsession with a series of books, but something that has taken you down a completely different rabbit hole, something that is just random and out of the box. Tell me I'm not the only one. And if you're new to my channel and don't want to run away, I do have a lot of videos in my backlist. Hopefully you stick around, subscribe. And if you want to help me out with this video, I appreciate a thumbs up. If you drop a comment, even if it's just a little detective hat. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.